I woke the way I had woken for 2,672 mornings, which is to say, I did not so much wake as surface, the way a stone surfaces from a slow current, without hurry and without expectation of warmth. The pallet beneath me was narrow and stuffed with straw that had long since flattened into something closer to the memory of straw, and I had learned, over the years, which three places on it were softest, and which two places I was obliged to avoid on account of the wooden slats beneath. I lay for a while without opening my eyes, because opening one's eyes, I had come to understand, is a small act of courage, and I preferred to ration my courage as I rationed everything else. When at last I did open them, the cellar was the color of a pearl that had been left too long in a drawer. A single shaft of light, no wider than my wrist, came down from the cracked window set high in the southern wall, and it lay across the stone floor like a thin piece of cloth someone had dropped in passing. I watched it for a long time. I had learned, over the years, that if one watched light carefully enough, one could see it moving, which was a thing I found useful, because it reminded me that the world outside was still turning, and that time, whatever else it did, still passed. My name is Serafina Valgard, and I was 15 years old when they closed the cellar door, and I was 22 when it was opened again, and between those two ages there were 7 winters and a little over 3 months, and I counted every one of them on the wall beside my pallet with a small piece of soft chalk that Hulda had brought me in the first year. The tally marks went in bundles of 5, the way I had been taught to count as a child at my mother's knee, and they ran along 3 courses of stone, and that morning, if I had troubled myself to count them, I would have found 7 years and 112 days, though I did not count them that morning, because I had already counted them the night before, and I was trying to teach myself that some things did not require counting twice. Beside the pallet, on an overturned wooden crate that had once held apples and now held me, as much as anything held me, sat Hulda's basket. She had left it in the small hours as she always did, passing it through the narrow slot at the base of the door that had been cut, originally, for the passage of cats, and which no one in the house above had thought to board up, because no one above imagined a grown woman could live on what could be slid through the gap left by a cat. There was a quarter loaf of dark rye bread wrapped in a cloth so worn it was more mend than weave. There was a small wedge of hard yellow cheese. There was a candle stub, scarcely 2 inches of tallow, and beside it 3 phosphorus matches in a little tin. There was also, as there was every Tuesday, a sprig of dried rosemary, because Hulda was a woman who believed that even prisoners were owed a little fragrance. I sat up slowly because sitting up quickly was a thing I had forgotten how to do. I drew the basket to me and I broke the bread in half, and I ate the smaller half and wrapped the larger half in the cloth again, because I had long since learned that a stomach which is given everything at once behaves like a child given everything at once, which is to say, badly. I chewed the bread carefully. The crust was dark and a little sour and tasted, I thought, of the earth itself, which was appropriate, as I had come to feel in some small way as though I were a seed that had been planted and forgotten. On the crate beside the basket sat my only book, and it had sat there for all of the 7 years, because Hulda had smuggled it to me in the 2nd month, wrapped in an old shawl, and she had told me, in the whisper she used through the grate, that my father had loved it, and that I should love it too, and that if I read it often enough I would find, as she had found, that all the weather of the world is somewhere in its pages. It was a worn, green-covered copy of The Tempest, and it had a small ink drawing on the flyleaf of a ship at sea, and someone, perhaps my father, had written in a hand I did not quite know, for her, on her 11th birthday, that she may love the storm. I had read it, I think, more than 100 times. I knew whole speeches by heart. I knew Miranda's pity, and Prospero's bitterness, and Caliban's grief, And I knew, most of all, the speech about our little life being rounded with a sleep, which I had recited to myself on the very worst of the nights, when I had been certain that sleep and death were, in the end, the same thing with different names. I opened it that morning to the first scene, as I often did, and I read to myself the cries of the mariners in the storm, and I spoke the word boatswain aloud, because I liked the sound of it, and my voice cracked on the word, because I had not spoken aloud the day before, and sometimes a voice, like a hinge, needs a little oil. I cleared my throat. I tried it again. Boatswain, I said, and this time the word came out whole, and I smiled at it, because smiling, too, was a muscle I tried to keep in working order. The cellar was perhaps 15 feet by 12, though I had not measured it, because a woman who measures her cell is a woman who is admitting it is her room. There was the pallet and the crate, and a second crate I used as a small table, and a bucket in the corner behind a screen I had made of 2 old sacks sewn together by a needle Huldah had given me in the 3rd year. There were shelves along one wall, empty of everything but dust and the memory of preserves. There was a stone floor, cold in all seasons, and stone walls, and a heavy oak door banded with black iron, and on the inside of that door, near the top, was the narrow grate through which Huldah passed her news, and at the bottom was the cat's slot through which she passed my bread. There was no stove. There was no fire. In winter I slept in every garment I owned, which was 3: a chemise, a wool gown that had once been blue and was now the color of old tea, and a shawl. And yet, that morning I was not cold, or I was no colder than I expected to be, which in the slow and patient language of captivity is the same thing as warm. I ate my bread. I read my book. I watched the thin piece of light move across the floor, and when it reached the foot of my pallet, I closed the book and set it down, and I laid my hand flat upon its cover, as I sometimes did, as one might lay a hand upon the back of a small, faithful animal. I did not know, that morning, that it was the last morning. I did not know that by nightfall the door would be open, and that the man who opened it would stand in the frame of it with snow still on his shoulders, and that my life would be split, clean as a log under a good axe, into the years before and the years after. I knew only that the light was moving, and that Huldah's bread was in my hand, and that Miranda had just spoken the line about brave new world, and that somewhere above me, very faintly, a dog was barking. My mother died when I was 8, of a fever that came out of the marshes in an August that had been too wet, and she died in the way she had lived, which is to say quietly, with her hand in my hand and a small smile on her mouth. And her last words to me were that I must be brave, which is a thing one says to a child when one has no better gift to give. My father, who had loved her entirely, did not die then, but a part of him did, and for 3 years he walked the halls of Ravenmere like a man looking for something he had mislaid. He was a good man, and he tried to be a good father, and he largely succeeded, but he was a lonely one, and loneliness, I have since come to understand, is a door that opens into a house, and not always the house one would have chosen. When I was 11, he married again. Her name was Celestia, and she had been the widow of a minor baronet in Durham, and she had pale hair the color of a winter field and eyes the color of river ice. And she came to Ravenmere with 3 trunks and a lady's maid, and a smile that did not reach her mouth in the same way her words did. She was not unkind to me, in the beginning. She was attentive even. She brought me ribbons from York, and she taught me how to hold a teacup by its rim rather than its handle, which she said was more elegant, and she called me her little dove, which I did not like, because I had a name, but which I tolerated, because my father seemed happy, and a happy father was a thing I had not seen in a long while. For 3 years we lived, the 3 of us, in something that resembled a family, I learned the pianoforte poorly. I learned French, rather better. I learned from Celestria how to enter a room and how to leave one, and how to carry oneself in a drawing room full of people one does not know. And I learned, too, though she did not mean to teach me, that there were smiles which were weapons and smiles which were not, and that one had best learn quickly which kind one was being given. My father died in the autumn of my 14th year, of a seizure of the heart, suddenly, in his library, with a book open on his knee, and a glass of claret untouched beside him. I was not in the house. I had gone with Hetty, my only close friend, to gather late blackberries in the lane beyond the orchard, and when we came back with our baskets full and our fingers stained, there was a carriage in the drive I did not know, and a doctor coming down the stairs shaking his head, and Celestria in the hall, and her face was composed, as it always was, but her eyes, I remember, were bright. And it took me many years to understand that the brightness in them was not grief. She was very efficient in the weeks that followed. She wore mourning. She received the mourners. She wrote the letters. She had the will read in the long drawing room by a solicitor from Newcastle. And I sat on a hard chair beside her. And I heard, without fully understanding, that my father had left the estate in trust, to be managed by Celestria until I came of age, and that I would inherit on my 21st birthday, or upon my marriage, whichever came the sooner. The solicitor looked at me when he read this, and his eyes were sorry, though I did not then know why. For 6 months, she was almost the woman she had been. Then, on an afternoon in April, when the daffodils were out along the south wall and a thrush was singing on the chimney pot, she called me into the morning room, and she told me, in a voice that was low and even and almost gentle, that I was to be sent to stay, for a short while, in the cellar, because I had become, she said, unstable in my grief, and because she feared I might do myself a harm, and because the cellar was cool and quiet and would be restful for my nerves. I remember that I laughed, because I thought she was joking, and because laughter is what one does when one has not yet understood that a thing is real. And then I saw her face, and I understood that it was real, and I stopped laughing. I did not go quietly. I am not proud of much, in that house, but I am proud of that. I struck her hand from my arm. I shouted for Huldah, who was in the kitchen and did not come because she had been locked in the pantry on Celestria's orders. I ran for the front door and I almost reached it. And then 2 of the footmen, new footmen, men Celestria had brought with her from Durham, took me by the elbows, very correctly, very gently, as if they were escorting me into a carriage, and they walked me down the long stone stairs to the cellar, and Celestria walked ahead of us with a candle in her hand, and she did not look back once. The door closed. I heard the key turn. I heard her voice through the oak, calm and distant, saying that she would send for me in due course. I beat my hands against the wood until my palms were hot and raw. I screamed for a while, though I do not like to remember the screaming. Then I stopped, because I had understood, even at 15, that a voice spent on stone is a voice wasted, and that I would need my voice for other things. In the first week, I believed she would come. In the first month, I believed my uncle in London, who had visited us twice, might write and inquire after me. In the first year, I believed Hetty might come knocking at the kitchen door. In the second year, I began to believe nothing at all, which, it turned out, was a kind of peace, though not the kind I would have chosen. Huldah came, that first night, when the house had gone quiet. She had pried open the little pantry lock with a hairpin, and she had crept down the cellar stairs in her stockinged feet, and she whispered to me through the grate that she loved me, and that she would not leave me, and that she would bring what she could, when she could, and that I must hold, I must hold, I must hold. She used the word 3 times. I have thought about it often. Hold. It is a word with a handle on it, a word one can grip. I gripped it. I held. Through 7 winters and 6 summers and all the moons between, I held, because Hulda had told me to, and because there was a basket at the bottom of the door every morning, and because, I suppose, I was my mother's daughter, and she had told me, too, that I must be brave. The sounds above me began a little after noon, though I did not at first pay them much mind, because sounds above me were as common as weather, and I had long since learned to let most of them pass through me as wind passes through a hedge. There were, on any ordinary day, the sounds of Celestria's slippers on the boards of the morning room, and the distant clatter of the kitchen, and the heavier tread of the footman, and sometimes the sharp, quick steps of her lady's maid, who had worn, for 7 years, a pair of shoes with a loose heel that clicked on every second step. But these sounds, when I gave them my attention at last, were different. There was the barking of dogs, and dogs at Ravenmere were not kept in the house. They were kept in the kennels down by the stable yard, and they were not permitted, by Celestria's decree, to come any nearer to the hall than the gravel sweep. And yet I could hear them, plainly, in the hall itself, their nails on the marble, their deep, agitated barking, the kind of barking a dog makes when it is in a strange place and is not sure whether to be frightened or brave. I sat very still on my pallet. I set down my book. I listened. There were boots. Not the boots of the footmen, which I had long since learned to distinguish by their weight and their pace. These were heavier, and more, and they came in a group, the way soldiers come, and I heard them cross the marble of the great hall and stop, and I heard a man's voice, pitched low but carrying, the kind of voice that does not need to be raised in order to be heard. I could not make out the words. I pressed my ear to the door, and the oak was thick, and the words were muffled, but I caught the cadence, which was the cadence of a man who was asking a question he already knew the answer to. Then I heard Celestria. Her voice was high and sharp and too quick, the voice she used when she had been surprised and was determined not to show it. I heard her say no, several times, and I heard her say impossible, and I heard her say, "You have been misinformed, sir." I did not hear what the man said in return, only that he said it, and that after he said it, there was a silence. And the silence was longer than any silence I had ever heard in that house. And then, while I was standing with my ear to the door, the grate above my head scraped open, just a crack, and Hulda's face appeared in the narrow light of it, and her eyes were wet, and her hands were shaking so that the grate rattled, and she whispered to me, very fast, in the whisper that was the voice of my entire adult life, "The Duke of Stormcairn has come. He knows about you." I stepped back from the door. I did not understand. I had heard of the Duke of Stormcairn, of course. Everyone in the North Country had heard of the Duke of Stormcairn, in the way that everyone in a county has heard of its storms. He had fought at Salamanca. He had fought at Vitoria. He had come home wounded and widowed and, they said, terrible. And he lived alone in the castle on the coast, and it was said of him that he had once horsewhipped a magistrate who had abused a tenant, and that he had once ridden a horse to death to reach a child dying of fever on a tenant farm. He was called, in the taverns, the Storm himself. He was called, in the drawing rooms, that dreadful Duke. Mothers warned their daughters. Fathers warned their sons. No one, so far as I knew, warned the Duke of anything, because there was no one left willing to try. I whispered back through the grate. "Hulda," I said, "I do not know him. Why should he come for me?" She shook her head. She said, "Hetty. You're Hetty. She married the young doctor out at Embleton, and my niece Morag is their maid, and Morag came home at Christmas, and I told her, child, I told her what she had promised never to tell, because I am an old woman and I could not bear it any longer, and Morag told Hetty, and Hetty wept for 2 days, and then Hetty wrote to the Duke, because her husband's father had served under him in Spain, and the Duke, God keep him, The Duke has come. How long? I said. How long has he been here? An hour, she said. He has ridden 3 days. He came in through the frost with his horse half lamed and his man with him, and he asked at the door for Miss Seraphina Valgard, and she, your stepmother, she told him there was no such person in the house. And then, Hulda said, he produced a paper. He said, Madam, I have here a copy of the parish register of this very church, certified not 2 weeks past by the rector, and it says that on the 14th of May in the year of our Lord 1788, a daughter was born to Sir Edmund Valgard and his wife Mary, and was baptized Seraphina Mary Valgard, and stands as the only legitimate issue of the said Sir Edmund. And I have not come 3 days through the snow to be told she does not exist. He said it, Hulda said, as calm as a man asking for a cup of tea. And your stepmother, she went white. I saw her go white. I was in the door of the dining room, and I saw her go white. I sat down on my pallet. I was shaking, though I did not know why, because I had not yet decided whether this was a thing to hope for or a thing to be afraid of. I had, over the years, learned to be suspicious of large changes, because large changes in the house above had, in my experience, been almost always for the worse. Is he a good man, Hulda? I asked. Tell me truly, is he a good man? She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I do not know, child. I have never met him. But I know this. He came. He came 3 days through the snow, and he is still standing in the hall. And he has not left. The grate closed softly. I heard her slip away up the steps. I sat on my pallet with my hands folded in my lap, and I listened to the boots of the Duke of Stormcairn moving about in the hall above my head. And I thought, for the first time in 7 years, that perhaps I had better comb my hair. I did not own a comb. I had, however, a small fragment of bone that had once been part of a hairpick, which Hulda had slipped to me in the 4th year, and I drew it now through my hair, which was long and dark and tangled, and I worked at it until the worst of the knots were loose, and I plaited it in a single plait down my back, and I tied the end with a thread I had pulled from the hem of my chemise. I washed my face with the last of the water in the basin. I straightened my shawl about my shoulders. I sat upon my pallet with my book in my lap, and I waited, because I had grown very good over the years at waiting. Above me, the argument had begun to take on a shape. I could not hear the words, but I could hear the rhythm of them, and the rhythm was that of a man who was not going to go away, and a woman who had not yet understood that the man was not going to go away. I heard Celestria's voice climb and crack. I heard a heavier voice answer, still quiet, still even. I heard a third voice join in, a younger man's voice, crisp as a parade ground, which I would later know as Captain Blackwell's. I heard footsteps moving from room to room. I heard doors open and close. Then, at length, I heard them on the cellar stairs. 3 pairs of boots, heavy and unhurried, and a 4th, lighter pair, which was Celestria's, and which had stopped, I could tell, several times, as if she were being made to come down and was dragging her feet in the way a child does when it is being led to its lessons. They came to a stop outside the door. I heard the heavy voice say, very politely, Madam, the key, if you please. I heard Celestria say, I do not have it. I heard the voice say, again, Madam, the key. I heard her say, more shrilly, I tell you, I do not have it. The lock is old, the door is swollen, no one has opened it in years, there is nothing behind it but preserves and rats. There was a pause. I heard the voice say, very quietly, Captain Blackwell, please escort Lady Valgard to the end of the passage and see that she remains there. I heard boots moving. I heard Celestria's voice rise in a tight protest and then fall away down the stone passage. I heard the heavier boots come forward, very close now, just on the other side of the oak. And I heard, then, a sound I had never heard before, a sound that seemed to me, in that moment, like the sound the world itself might make if it decided to turn. It was the sound of a shoulder against a door. It came twice. The first blow was a deep, heavy thud that made the door shudder in its frame, and a fine gray dust fell from the lintel, and I saw it drift down in the thin shaft of light from the window, slow as snow. I had time, between the first blow and the second, to set my book aside, and to stand, and to smooth the front of my gown with my hands, as my mother had once taught me to do before one greeted a guest. The second blow was louder, and there was a cracking sound inside the lock itself. An almost human cry of old iron giving way, and the oak split along its banding, and the door swung back upon its hinges with a long groan, and more dust fell, and the cold air of the passage beyond came in upon me, and with the cold air came a smell I had not smelled in 7 years, which was the smell of a man who had been outdoors, the smell of horse and leather and cold wool and, very faintly, of juniper. He stood in the doorway. He was very tall. He filled the frame of the door, and his shoulders almost touched the stones on either side, and he was dressed entirely in black riding coat and black gloves and black boots mud-flecked to the knee, and his hair, which was also dark, was wet with melted snow, and snow still clung to the capes of his greatcoat, and his face, in the dim light, was lean and hard and tired, and his eyes, which I could only just see, were gray, the color of the sea when the sun has gone behind a cloud. He did not step into the cellar. I understood later that this was deliberate, that he had judged, in some swift private way, that for him to come in uninvited would be to trade one kind of captivity for another, and that he had decided not to do it. He stood at the threshold. He took off his hat. He inclined his head, very slightly, the way one inclines one's head at a first introduction in a drawing room. He said, "Miss Valgard?" I said, "Yes." He said, "My name is Cassian de Beaufort-Valesmere. I am the Duke of Stormcairn. Miss Valgard, would you like to come out?" I wish I could tell you that I stepped forward at once, as if answering a bell. I did not. I stood for a long moment on the stone floor of my cellar, with my hand resting on the edge of my crate, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and neither of us spoke, and the dust of the broken lintel went on falling through the thin shaft of light between us, and I thought, quite absurdly, of Miranda in the play, and of her line, "Oh, wonder." I did not say it, but I thought it. Then I stepped forward. I put one foot in front of the other. I crossed the stone floor slowly because my legs were not strong, and I passed through the broken doorway, and I stood in the passage, and the Duke of Stormcairn stepped back to make room for me, and he said softly, "This way, if you please," and I walked behind him up the cellar stairs. I have tried, many times since, to remember what it was like to step into the great hall of Ravenmere for the first time in 7 years, and I can remember only fragments of it, because I think the mind, when it has been starved of something for long enough, cannot quite absorb that thing all at once when it is returned. I remember the brightness. That I remember clearly. I remember the brightness hitting my eyes like a hand, and my eyes watering, and the water blurring everything into smears of gold and white, and my having to put a hand up to shield my face, and the Duke, without looking at me, without saying anything, moving to place his own body between me and the long window, so that I stood in the shadow of him until my eyes could bear the light. I remember the space. The ceiling of the great hall at Ravenmere is 22 feet high, and I had lived, for 7 years, in a room with a ceiling I could touch with an outstretched hand if I stood on my crate, and when I looked up and saw the height of the hall above me, I thought, quite honestly, that I might fall upward into it, the way a stone falls downward through water. I remember reaching out, and my hand finding his sleeve, and his hand covering mine with his own, very lightly for just a moment, and then letting go. I remember the faces. Captain Blackwell, whose name I did not yet know, standing by the great staircase with his hand on the pommel of his sword, watching Celestia, who stood at the far end of the hall between two of his men, and whose face was a white mask from which the eyes glittered like broken glass. Hulda, by the passage to the kitchen, her hands pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. A man I did not know in a bottle green coat, the magistrate I would learn later, taking notes in a small leather book. I remember the cold. The hall was unheated because Celestia had not expected guests, and the January wind was coming in under the great oak doors, and I was shivering. Suddenly, more than I had shivered in the cellar, because the cellar had been its own contained kind of cold, and this was a new cold, a wide cold, a cold with distances in it. The Duke saw it. He unfastened his own greatcoat, the black one with the snow still on it, and he swung it from his shoulders in a single movement, and he laid it about mine, and it was warm from his body, and it was heavy, and it smelled of juniper and horse and cold wool, and I held it closed at my throat with both hands, because my hands had found something to do at last. He stepped back. He inclined his head again. I looked up at him. I had to tilt my chin to do it, because he was so much taller than I had grown used to anyone being, and my voice, when I spoke, was the small cracked voice of a person who had not used it properly in 7 years, and I was ashamed of it, though I should not have been. I said, "Who are you?" He said, "I told you. I am the Duke of Stormcairn." I said quietly, "I thought the Duke of Stormcairn was a monster." He did not smile. He did not laugh. He did not make light of it, as many men would have. And I have thanked him in my mind 1,000 times for that, because I had not the strength, that afternoon, for lightness. He looked down at me with his gray, tired eyes, and he said very simply, "So did I once." Then he turned, and he said to Captain Blackwell, "Send to Alnwick for the magistrate Sir Peregrine Tyndall at once, and tell him the matter is urgent but not violent, and that I require his presence by tomorrow noon." He said to Hulda, "Ma'am, a fire in the morning room, if you please, and hot broth, not rich, and bread, and the lady will sit." He said to me, "Miss Valgard, will you allow me to take you to the morning room? You need not speak to anyone further today. I shall stand outside the door if you prefer." I said, "You may come in." And so he did. I will not dwell over long on the hours that followed, because they were, for me, a blur of broth and warmth and small soft words, and a chair drawn up to a fire, and Hulda kneeling on the hearthrug and weeping into her apron, and the Duke sitting on the far side of the room in a straight-backed chair with his gloved hands resting on his knees, saying nothing, simply being there, the way a large rock is there in a field, without fuss and without demand. I drank the broth. I ate a small piece of bread. I fell asleep in the chair, with Hulda's hand on my hair, and when I woke it was full dark, and candles had been lit, and the Duke had not moved, and Captain Blackwell had come and gone and come back again, and the magistrate was already on the road from Alnwick. He came the next day a little before noon. His name was Sir Peregrine Tyndall, and he was a small, neat, gray-haired man with spectacles and a quiet manner, and he had served, I learned later, as a magistrate in that part of Northumbria for 31 years. The Duke met him in the drive and walked with him up to the house, and I watched from the window of the morning room, with Hulda's shawl about my shoulders and a cup of weak tea growing cold in my hands, and I saw them talking together for a long while on the gravel, the Duke tall and dark and bending his head slightly to listen, Sir Peregrine short and gray and nodding, and I thought, this is a man who has seen many things and I am not the worst of them, which comforted me, though I could not have said why. The interview, when it came, was brief and merciful. Sir Peregrine sat with me in the morning room, with the Duke standing by the window looking out at the grounds with his back half turned, and he asked me, in a soft, even voice, only what he needed to ask. My name, my age, the date, as near as I could remember it, of the day the door had been closed, the name of the person who had closed it, the name of the person, if any, who had ever opened it, the names of those in the house who had known. I answered him truthfully. I did not elaborate. The Duke did not turn around. I saw his hand, once, tighten on the sill of the window. Then it loosened again. Celestria was placed under house arrest that afternoon, in her own morning room at Ravenmere, with 2 of Sir Peregrine's men at her door. The appropriation of the estate, Sir Peregrine told me, was a separate matter, and would be adjudicated separately, but the charge of illegal detention of the lawful heir was, in his view, sufficient to hold her on its own, and she would be tried at the next quarter sessions in Alnwick, and until then she would not leave the house, and she would not see me, and she would not, he said very gently, be permitted to speak to any servant without his clerk present. I nodded. I said, "Thank you, sir." I said, "May I go now?" I meant, may I go somewhere that is not this house? I did not have the strength to say it properly. He understood. The Duke turned from the window. He said, "Miss Valgard, with your permission, I should like to take you to Stormcairn. Not as a bride, madam, and not as a bondswoman, as a ward, under the protection of my house, for such time as you require, and no longer than you wish. Your friend Mrs. Caldwell Durrant has expressed her willingness to come and stay with you there. Mrs. Penwyn, if she is willing, will come also, and will be provided for out of my own estate for the remainder of her life. Dr. Mallowby, who is my physician and a good man, will travel with us to see to your health. You need not decide now. You may think upon it." I thought upon it. I thought upon it for perhaps 10 seconds, because I had been thinking upon it, in some sense, since the moment his shoulder had broken the lock. I said, "Yes." I said, "Thank you." I said, "When do we go?" He said, "When you are ready, madam. Not before." We went 3 days later in a traveling carriage he had sent for from Alnwick, with a pair of greys and a coachman in a black caped coat, and Huldah beside me, and Captain Blackwell riding alongside, and the Duke on his own horse ahead, and Dr. Mallowby in a second smaller carriage behind with Hetty, who had come on the second day, who had come in through the front door of Ravenmere, and seen me in the morning room and stopped dead upon the threshold, and pressed both her hands to her mouth, and stood so for a full half-minute before she could cross the room, and who had then held me so tightly and so long that I felt my bones remember they were bones. And so, in the first week of February in the year 1811, with the snow still thick upon the moor, and the sky the grey of old pewter, I left Ravenmere Hall, where I had lived for 22 years, 7 of them behind an oak door, and I rode northeast across Northumberland toward the sea, with the Duke of Stormcairn at the head of our small train, and my oldest friend in the carriage behind me, and my truest friend beside me in the carriage I sat in. And I watched the countryside go by through the window, and I wept, not loudly, not in any way that needed comforting, but steadily and quietly and without stopping, for the better part of 3 hours, because I had not seen a tree in 7 years, and the trees, on that road, were beautiful beyond speaking, even in their winter bareness. If you are listening to this story and it has, in some small way, found you, I ask only that you stay a little longer, and that you let the lamp in Seraphina's hand burn a little further for you. There is more to tell, and the telling is gentler than what has passed. Stormcairn Castle stood on a great grey rock above the sea, And it had stood there, the Duke told me later, for 600 years, since a Beaufort-Valesmere ancestor had built it against the Scots, and the weather, and the general uncertainty of being a man in a cold country. It was not a pretty castle. It was a sturdy one, with square towers and thick walls and narrow windows, and a great hall with a hearth you could have roasted an ox in, and a small chapel built into one of the towers, and a long gallery hung with portraits of unsmiling men in armor, and unsmiling women in lace, and a walled garden that in February was only a geometry of bare hedges and black earth, but which in April, the Duke said, would be something else altogether. My rooms were in the South Tower, because the South Tower caught the morning sun, and because, the Duke said, I had had enough of cold and of the north side of things. They were 3 rooms, a sitting room and a bedroom, and a small dressing room, and they had been hung with pale yellow hangings, because Hetty had ridden ahead with Mrs. Bardell the housekeeper, and had chosen the hangings herself. And Hetty had always said that pale yellow was the color of mourning, and that mourning was the color a recovering heart required. There was a writing desk. There was a low chair by the fire. There was a bookshelf, empty, because the Duke had said, in the note he had left on the mantel, that he did not presume to choose my books for me, and that I should come to the library and choose my own when I was ready. There was a bed. I had not slept in a bed in 7 years. It was a large bed, of old dark oak, with 4 posts and a canopy of the same pale yellow as the hangings, and a mattress that was not straw, and linen sheets, and 3 wool blankets, and a counterpane of embroidered flowers. I stood and looked at it for a long time on the first evening. Hetty sat in the chair by the fire and watched me, and she did not rush me, and when I at last sat down on the edge of the bed and put my hand on the counterpane, I found that the counterpane, though old, was warm, because the maids had put a warming pan in it an hour before, and the heat of it went up my arm and into my chest like a swallow of brandy, and I put my other hand over my face and I cried. And Hetty crossed the room and sat beside me and put her arm about my shoulders and said nothing at all, which was what I needed, and which she had always been wise enough to know. The first night I did not sleep in the bed. I slept on the floor beside it, wrapped in one of the blankets, because my body, which had slept on stone for 7 years, did not know what to do with so much softness, and the softness alarmed it. Hetty did not remark upon it. On the second night I slept half in the bed, with my feet hanging off the side, as a child does. On the third night I slept in the bed fully, and I slept for 11 hours. And when I woke, the sun was high and Hetty was in the sitting room, reading a novel and humming, and on the table beside me was a cup of chocolate and a plate of thin buttered toast, and I understood, in some quiet way, that I had arrived. Dr. Mallaby came every day for the first fortnight, and every other day for the fortnight after that, and once a week thereafter through the spring. He was a grave, kind man with gray whiskers and a soft Northumbrian accent, and he spoke to me always as if I were a person rather than a patient, which I had not known I needed until he did it. He weighed me. He listened to my chest. He looked at my hands and my feet and my eyes and my teeth, and he prescribed broth and milk and eggs and slow, gentle walks, and he said, "Madam, the body is a patient beast, and it will forgive much, if only we give it time and good food," and he said it so many times that it became a kind of motto in the house, and Hetty and I would say it to one another over breakfast, and we would laugh, and then I would look up and be startled by my own laughter, because I had not known I still had that particular sound in me. Mrs. Huldah Penwyn came north with us and stayed 3 weeks, and then said she must go home because she was 62 years old and she had never lived outside the county of her birth, and Durham was as far as she could bear, and she would like, if it was all the same to his grace, to be settled near her sister in a small cottage by Alnwick, with a garden for her herbs and a cat for her knee. The Duke arranged it. He bought her a cottage. He settled an annuity on her, sufficient that she would never again need to count coppers for her tea, and he wrote the deed and the annuity, both in her name alone, not in her husband's, because her husband had died 15 years before. And she had been, the Duke said to me quietly over supper, the nearest thing to a mother I had had for 7 years, and he would not have her want for anything for the time that remained to her. I cried when she went. She cried also. We stood in the courtyard of Stormcairn by the carriage that was to take her, and she held my face in both her hands, and she said, "Child, I held," and she smiled through her tears, because we both knew the word, and I said, "Huldah, you did. You held me all those years." And she said, "And now you must hold yourself, and you must let these good people hold you, and you must live." Then she climbed into the carriage and she went, and I watched the carriage out of sight down the winding road, and Hetty put her arm through mine, and we went in. The days began to take on a shape. I woke with the sun, because the south tower caught it full on the face, and a maid brought chocolate, and I drank it in bed slowly, because slowness was a luxury I was learning to practice. I washed. I dressed, in the gowns Hetty had ordered for me, simple gowns of soft wool and softer muslin, in the colors of dawn and of milk. I went down to breakfast, where the Duke was usually already sitting at the far end of the long table with his coffee and his letters, and where he would rise when I came in, and bow and say good morning, Miss Valgard, and where he would not require me to speak further if I did not wish to. After breakfast, I would go to the library. It was a long room on the first floor with 2 fires at either end, and 3 great windows looking out upon the sea, and shelves from floor to ceiling along every wall, and a rolling ladder on brass wheels, and a long reading table in the middle. I had been afraid of it at first, because it was so large, and because I had been without books, except one, for so long, and I did not know, at 22, what kinds of books I liked, because a girl of 15 and a woman of 22 are not the same reader, and I had been the one when I went in, and was the other when I came out. I began with poetry, because poetry was short, and because short was what I could manage. I read Cowper and I read Gray, and I read, in a fine-bound volume I had never seen before, the poems of a woman called Anna Seward of Lichfield, who had died not long before, and who had written of friendship and grief and the lights of a small English town in a way that made me sit very still for a long time with the book on my lap. I read, slowly, through the plays of Shakespeare I had not known, which was most of them, because in the cellar I had only The Tempest, and when I came at last to As You Like It, and found Rosalind in the forest teaching men and women what love was by pretending not to be either, I laughed aloud, and the Duke, passing the library door, put his head in briefly and then withdrew, smiling, without a word. I began, in March, to walk in the grounds. At first only the terrace, and only with Hetty beside me, and only for 10 minutes at a time, because Dr. Mallaby had said I must build up to it the way one builds up a fire, stick by stick. By the middle of March I was walking to the wall of the walled garden and back, alone, which was perhaps 300 paces, and by the end of March I could walk the full length of the south terrace twice without having to stop, and I would stand at the stone balustrade at the end and look out over the cliff and the sea. And the sea would be gray and white and very loud, and I would feel the wind upon my face, and I would think, this is mine also. This wind, this water, this sky, they belong to me as much as to any living soul. And they were mine while I was in the cellar too, only I could not see them. In April, the Duke sent to Alnwick for a horse. She was a small bay mare called Juniper, with a white star on her forehead and a gentle disposition, and she had been, the groom told me, a child's pony before she had grown into what she was, and she had the patience of a schoolmistress. The Duke had chosen her himself. He did not make a great matter of presenting her to me. He simply came to the library one afternoon where I was reading, and he said, "Miss Valgard, there is someone I should like you to meet in the stable yard when you are free." And he withdrew, and when I went down half an hour later, there she was, standing in the cobbled yard with the groom holding her bridle, and the Duke standing by her shoulder with one hand on her neck. And he said, "Her name is Juniper, madam, and she is yours if you will have her." And I stood for a long moment and I looked at her, and she looked back at me with a calm brown eye, and I said, "Thank you, your grace. I will have her. Yes, I will." I had ridden as a girl. I had ridden before my mother died on a fat pony called Tuffet, who had died in the year after I was locked away, Huldah had told me, of old age, peaceably, in his field. I had not sat a horse in 9 years. The first day I mounted Juniper, with the groom at her head and the Duke standing at a distance by the mounting block, I was shaking so hard that Juniper herself turned her head and looked at me as if to say, "Madam, compose yourself." And I laughed, and I patted her neck, and I walked her in a slow circle about the yard, and by the time I had completed the circle my hands were steady, and by the end of the week I was riding her at a walk down the long lane to the cliff, and by the end of April I was riding at a trot, with the Duke riding a great black gelding beside me, and the wind in my hair, and the sea off to our right, gray and white and endless, and I understood that I had not known in the cellar how big the world was, but that I had always suspected, and that my suspicion had been correct. The Duke was present through all of this, and yet not present in the way a man who wants something is present. He did not seek me out. He did not press me for conversation. He did not arrange entertainments to draw me forth. He went about his own business, which was large and various, for he was the chief landowner of that part of the coast, and had, besides, a seat in the Lords which he attended when he could not avoid it. And he left me to my own days. And yet, when I entered a room, he rose, and when I spoke, he listened, and when I walked, he walked near enough that I was not alone, and far enough that I was not crowded. And I came to understand, over those weeks and months, that he was doing for me a thing I had not known anyone could do, which was to be near without requiring. It was on a Wednesday in April, and the walled garden had come into a sudden fury of daffodils, thousands of them, it seemed, planted by some long-dead Duchess of Stormcairn who had had a taste for yellow, and the sun was out, and the sea wind had for once dropped, and Hetty had gone into the village on an errand for the household, and I was walking in the walled garden alone, wearing a gown of pale green muslin and a straw bonnet that Hetty had insisted upon, and I came round the corner by the old sundial, and I found the Duke there already, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at a small red stone set into the south wall, which I had never noticed before. He turned when he heard my step. He did not start. He inclined his head. He said, "Miss Valgard, I did not mean to intrude upon your walk. I shall leave you to it." I said, "Your Grace, please do not leave me to it. I should like, if you will permit it, to walk with you." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Of course." We walked, and for a little while we walked in silence, because silence had become, with us, a kind of conversation, and we were both of us easy in it. We passed the sundial. We passed the espaliered pears on the western wall. We came to the stone bench under the yew arch at the far end, and he stopped and looked at the bench, and he said, "Will you sit?" I sat. He sat, at a proper distance, with his hat on his knee. He looked not at me, but at the daffodils, which moved faintly in the small breeze. I said, "Your Grace." He said, "Ma'am." I said, "May I ask you something?" It is a thing I have wanted to ask you since the first day. I have waited until I thought I could bear the answer, whichever answer it was. He said, "Ask." I said, "Why? Why did you come? You had never met me." Hetty's letter might have been a fiction. Morag's tale might have been a child's tale. You might have sent a clerk from your estate. You might have written a polite letter to the magistrate. You might have done nothing at all, as every other person who might have heard did nothing at all, and no one would have thought the less of you for it. Why did you come yourself? Why did you ride 3 days through the frost? Why did you put your shoulder to the door? He did not answer at once. He turned the hat on his knee, slowly, once, around. He looked at the stone at his feet. Then he looked up, and he looked not at me, but at the high wall of the garden, and beyond it, I think, at something he alone could see. He said, "I was married, madam, to a woman I was given to in my 21st year, and whom I came, in time, to love deeply, though she never loved me. She was not unkind. She was only far away. She lived in my house for 8 years, and she bore me no children, and she died of a lung fever in the winter of 1807, and I buried her in the chapel here, and I walked through the halls of this castle for 3 years afterward, and I did not hear my own footsteps, because the house was so silent around them, and because I had begun to be silent also." He said, "I have seen, madam, what silence does to a house. I have seen a house full of living people become a house full of people who do not speak, because no one has begun to speak, because the first to speak must have courage, and courage has fled. I have seen a man, myself, sit at a dinner table for a year with his wife across from him, and neither of them say anything that mattered, because they had forgotten how. And I have seen that silence take her, in the end, as much as the fever did. I have seen what silence does." He said, "When Mrs. Caldwell Durrant's letter reached me, and I read that there was a young woman not 40 miles from my own walls who had been made to live in silence for 7 years, in a cellar, alone, behind a locked door, and that the people of that house, who were many, had sat above her through 7 winters, and eaten their dinners, and paid their tithes, and said their grace and known, and none of them had come for her. I thought of my own dining room, and the silence of it, and of how I had not come for my own wife in time, though I had been sitting across from her, and how a woman can be in a locked room of a sort even when there is no door, and how, at the very least, I could open a door that had in fact a lock." He said, "I came, madam, because I could not leave you in a silent house. I came because I had seen what silence does. I came because my feet had learned in my own halls what yours were learning in yours, and I thought that perhaps, if I came, we might together unlearn it." I did not speak for a long while. The daffodils moved. A bee, the first of the season, went past my ear, low and unhurried. The Duke sat with his hat on his knee and did not look at me, and I was glad of it, because I could not have borne being looked at. At last I said, "Your Grace, I am glad you came." He said, "Madam, so am I." We sat on a little longer. Then we rose, both together, as if we had decided it between us without speaking, and we walked back up the garden path to the castle, and we did not speak again until we reached the door, and when we reached the door he bowed and I curtsied, and we went each our own way. And I went up to my yellow rooms and I sat by the window, and I looked out at the sea for a long time, and I thought about silence, and about the breaking of it, and about the difference between the two kinds. The trial was held at Elmwick in the last week of May, at the quarter sessions, and I had long since decided that I would attend. The Duke had tried gently to dissuade me. Hetty had tried less gently. Dr. Mallaby had tried gravely. I had thanked them all, and I had said that I must go, because a thing that had been done to me in the dark must, if I was to live with it, be undone in the light, and that I would not hide from it, and that I would go veiled if that would answer, but that I would go. In the end, they had exceeded. I wore a gray gown and a black half-cloak and a black veil, and I sat in the gallery of the court with Hetty on one side of me and Captain Blackwell on the other. The Duke had insisted on sitting on the main floor with the witnesses, so that he might be close enough to Celestria to observe her, and so that, I think, he might make himself the target of any look she should wish to direct upward at me. He sat in the second row, very still, in his black coat, and I could see the back of his head from where I sat, and I found it a comfort. Celestria came in between two constables. She was much changed. Her pale hair had gone paler, almost white at the temples, and she was thinner, and her gown, though neat, was the gown of a woman who no longer cared greatly how she was seen. She did not look at the gallery. She did not, I think, know I was there. Or, if she knew, she refused to know. She sat in the dock with her hands folded in her lap, and she answered the questions put to her in a low, tired voice, and she did not deny what she had done, because the evidence of it had been too carefully gathered, and her solicitor had told her, I learned later, that denial would be worse than admission, and so she admitted. The charges were read: illegal detention of the lawful heir to the Valgard estate, appropriation of rents and revenues belonging to the said heir, obstruction of a magistrate in the discharge of his duty, in the matter of the initial questioning, conspiracy, in that she had procured the silence of servants. The judge, an elderly man with white eyebrows and a tired, kind face, heard the evidence through 2 days. He heard the solicitors, he heard the doctor. He heard, briefly and with his head bowed, the Duke, who spoke only to describe what he had found on the afternoon of the 17th of January, and who spoke plainly, and who did not embellish, and who did not once look in Celestria's direction. On the afternoon of the second day, the judge gave his sentence. He said that he had considered the case long and carefully, that he had weighed the 7 years and the matter of the estate, that he had weighed also the age of the accused and the absence of physical cruelty in the strict sense, and that he had concluded that the proper sentence, in the light of all these things, was transportation for the term of 14 years to the colony of New South Wales, the estate to be restored in full to the rightful heir, and the accused to be conveyed to the hulks at Chatham within the month. Celestria did not react. She had, I think, known for some days what the sentence would be. She rose when she was told to rise. She bowed her head when she was told to bow it. She was led from the dock, and she passed within 10 feet of where I sat in the gallery, and she did not look up, though I lifted my veil, because I did not wish to be hidden from her if she should chance to look, and I wished her to see, if she did, that I had not been undone. The judge rose. The court rose. I rose, also, and I spoke, because I had asked permission before the session began, and it had been granted on the grounds of my being the injured party. My voice was small in that large room, but it was even. I spoke only 4 words, and I spoke them to the judge, because I did not trust myself to speak them to her. I said, I hope she is given a lamp. The judge inclined his head to me very slightly in the old courteous way, and he said, Madam, I shall direct that she is. I let the veil fall. I sat down. Hetty took my hand. The court emptied. Outside, on the steps, in the late May sunshine, the Duke was waiting. He did not ask me whether I was well. He did not ask me whether I wished to go home. He simply offered me his arm, and I took it, and we walked together to the carriage, and I got in, and Hetty got in after me, and the Duke mounted his black gelding, and we rode back through the afternoon to Stormcairn, and nobody spoke, and nobody needed to. That night, I slept a full 9 hours, and I did not dream, and when I woke, I went down to breakfast, and I found upon my plate, under a small silver cover, a single sprig of rosemary, and I looked up at the Duke, who was at the far end of the table with his coffee, And he inclined his head, and I understood that Huldah, who was staying with us for a week, had told him, and that he had remembered, and that he had meant the rosemary as a greeting from her and from the old world into the new, and I held it to my face for a moment, and I smelled it, and I put it into the bosom of my gown, and I began upon my toast. June came. The roses came with it. The walled garden, which had been a geometry of daffodils in April and a fury of tulips in May, became in June a soft explosion of pink and white and deep red, and the sea wind carried their scent through every window of the castle. I was 23 now, for my birthday had come in May and had been marked, quietly, at Stormcairn, with a cake and a small ring of pearls from the Duke that had been his mother's, and which he had given me with the words that a birthday should be known, and that 7 of mine had not been, and that I might consider this one to be 7.5, if I liked. Though in the book of the parish register I was still of course only 1 year older than I had been the year before. I was heavier now, by perhaps 2 stone, and Dr. Mallowby pronounced himself satisfied. I was stronger. I could walk to the cliff and back without stopping. I could ride Juniper at a canter along the beach at low tide, with Hetty on her little gray beside me, both of us laughing, our hair coming loose from our bonnets. I could read a whole afternoon at a stretch. I could sit at table with company, for the Duke did occasionally have company, and I could speak to a bishop, and to a general, and to the old Countess of Warkworth, and not lose my breath. And I could laugh at a joke, and I could make one, though I was still slow at that. And I often laughed a beat after everyone else, which Hetty said was charming. On a Wednesday, in the first week of June, I walked again in the walled garden, and again I came round the corner by the sundial, and again the Duke was there, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the small red stone set into the south wall. He turned when he heard my step. He did not start. He inclined his head. It was the same choreography as April, and I think he meant it to be, and I was grateful for it, because I had a notion, that morning, of what might be coming, and familiar ground was easier ground. He said, "Miss Valgard." I said, "Your Grace." He said, "May I walk with you?" I said, "Please." We walked. We came to the stone bench under the yew arch at the far end. He stopped and looked at the bench and said, "Will you sit?" I sat. He sat at a proper distance, with his hat on his knee, as before. He looked not at me, but at the roses, which moved faintly in the small breeze. He said, "Madam." I said, "Yes." He said, "I had thought, when I came for you in January, that I had come only because I could not leave you in a silent house, and that I should thereafter see you settled, and see your estate restored, and see you married well in your own time to some good young man of my acquaintance, and that my part should be, in this matter, the part of an uncle or of an elder cousin, and no more." I said nothing. I looked at the roses also. He said, "I find, madam, that I was mistaken in myself. I find that my part, if you will have it, is not that of an uncle. I find that in the months since I first saw you step out of that cellar, I have come to love you, madam, in a quiet and considered way, and that the love has grown through every walk we have taken and every silence we have kept and every word we have said, and that it is now no longer possible for me to tell you that it is not there because it is there, and because you deserve to be told." He turned the hat on his knee, slowly, once, around. He said, "I am not asking you, madam, for an answer today. I am not asking you for an answer this month. I am not asking you for an answer this year, if it should take a year. I am asking only whether you would be willing, in your own time and at your own pace, to consider becoming my wife, and the Duchess of Stormcairn, and the keeper of this house which has been too long silent, and which you have already, by your presence, begun to make less so." I am asking, madam, only the question. Whatever you answer, and whenever you answer it, will be right. If you answer no, you will remain here as my ward for as long as you wish, and you will depart, when you depart, to a house of your own choosing, with a portion from me that shall see you settled, and we shall be, I hope, friends always. If you answer yes, we shall be, I hope, friends always, and more. If you answer, give me more time, I shall give you more time. He stopped. He looked at me then, for the first time. His gray eyes, in the June light, were softer than I had ever seen them, and a little afraid, which in a man of his kind was, I thought, a brave thing for a face to be. I said, Your Grace. He said, Ma'am. I said, Give me a year. He drew a breath. I said, I have only just learned to be a person again. I have only just learned to be this person who can ride a horse and laugh at a joke and sit at table with a general. I have not yet learned to be a woman in a full and ordinary sense. I have not yet learned to be a wife, or to be a duchess, or to be any of the things beyond being a person. I should like a year to learn. I should like to spend the year learning here, in this house, with you as my friend, and with Hetty coming to visit, and with Juniper in the stable. And I should like to come back to this bench in June of next year, and I should like to give you my answer then. Will you take the year? He did not answer at once. He looked at me, and I saw something move behind his eyes, which I understood to be relief. And I understood, too, that he had, perhaps, feared a plainer no, and had prepared himself for it, and was now adjusting himself to a thing that was not a yes, but was very much not a no either. He bowed his head, not as a lord to a lady, but as a knight to his king, deeply from the neck. He said, Madam, I shall take the year. I shall take it gladly. I shall come to this bench on the first Wednesday of June in the year 1812, and I shall wait here. And you shall come when you are ready, and whatever you say then, I shall hear, and I shall honor. And in the year between, madam, I shall be your friend, and I shall be in no respect other than your friend, unless you yourself should say otherwise, which you are under no obligation to do. I said, Thank you, your grace. He said, Cassian, if you like. In private, if you like. I said, Cassian, in private, if you like. He smiled then, a small, slow smile that barely touched his mouth, and it was the first smile I had seen from him that was not a courtesy. And I thought, oh, and I also thought, I shall see more of those, and I shall earn them. The year passed in the way years do when one is becoming a person. I shall not describe it in detail, because there was in it nothing of the drama of what had gone before, and because a recovery, by its nature, is mostly weather. There were fair days and there were gray days. There were letters. There were visits. Hetty's first child was born in November, a boy, and they named him, with her husband's glad consent, Cassian, after our Duke. And I stood as godmother at the christening in the little stone church at Embleton, and I wept, because a child named for kindness is a kind of lamp that is given back to the world. Huldah came to stay for a fortnight at Christmas, and she sat in her own chair by the great hearth, and she knitted a pair of mittens for my cold hands, and she told Hetty stories of me as a little girl, and I was not sorry to hear them, because I had half forgotten that there had been a little girl. The Duke and I were friends, in that year, in the way we had agreed we should be. We walked, we rode, we read. We sat at chess in the library in the long evenings, and he let me win only once, on the night of my birthday, and I scolded him for it, and he laughed, and promised not to do it again, and he did not. We spoke of his wife sometimes, and of my mother, and of Salamanca, and of the cellar, because we had both of us come to understand that a grief not spoken of is a silence laid over a house, and neither of us wished to lay silence over this one. We laughed, often. I had not known, in my first weeks at Stormcairn, that he had a laugh at all. He had one. It was a low, soft one, and it came, when it came, from the chest, and it was worth waiting for. In March of that year, the estate of Ravenmere was formally restored to me by a deed drawn up in Newcastle and signed in the Duke's library with the magistrate as witness, and the old solicitor from my father's time, who had retired and who came out of retirement on the Duke's request, standing by. I signed my name, Seraphina Valgard, in the same looping hand I had used at 14, because the hand had, it turned out, slept in my fingers along with everything else, and had waited for me to wake it. I did not return to Ravenmere. I had my steward appointed, a good man recommended by Captain Blackwell, and I visited it once, in April, with Hetty and the Duke, to walk the grounds and to speak to the tenants and to stand, for a moment, in the cellar doorway, which had been repaired and painted white, and which I stood in for perhaps a full minute, with the Duke at my shoulder, and Hetty holding my other hand, and I did not go in, but I did not turn away either, and when at last I stepped back, I said quietly, "It is only a room," and we went up the stairs, and we did not go down again. The first Wednesday of June in the year 1812 was a bright, soft day, with small clouds moving over the sea and the roses just come into their full glory. And I walked out into the walled garden, and I came round the corner by the sundial, and the Duke was there, as we had agreed, with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the small red stone set into the south wall. He turned. He inclined his head. His gray eyes were very still. I did not make him ask. I crossed to him, and I took his hand, which was bare that morning because he had left his gloves indoors, and I held it in both of mine, and I said, "Cassian, my answer is yes. I have learned, in the year. I have learned to be a person, and I have learned that there is room, in this person, also to be your wife. I should like to be your duchess. I should like to spend the rest of my days in this house with you, and to fill it with whatever noise we can, and to laugh at your jokes and to lose to you at chess sometimes, on purpose, as you lost to me, and to ride along the beach at low tide, and to grow old in your company. If you will have me." He put his other hand over mine. He said, very quietly, "Madam, I shall have you." We were married at midsummer of the year 1812, on a Thursday, in the small chapel in the northeast tower of Stormcairn Castle, in a ceremony so small that it fit within the chapel's 8 pews, with room to spare. The chapel had been decorated by Hetty, who had gathered every white rose and every sprig of rosemary the garden could spare, and who had woven them into garlands along the chancel rail, and who had set candles in the sconces along the stone walls, 24 of them, one for each year of my life as a Valgard, and one for the year of my becoming a Beaufort Valesmere as well. The chapel smelled of roses and rosemary and beeswax. I wore a gown of pale ivory silk, very simply cut, with long sleeves, because the chapel was cool even in June, and a veil of my mother's lace, which Huldah had kept all those years in a cedar chest in the pantry at Ravenmere, and which had been sent up to me in the week before the wedding wrapped in tissue and a letter in her shaky hand that read simply, "Child, she would have wanted you to have it, and I did my best to keep it for you." My hair was dressed with a small circlet of white roses, and I carried no bouquet because my hands were full enough, I thought, with the lace and the day. I walked myself to the altar. The Duke had offered, in the week before, to have Captain Blackwell give me away, or Dr. Malloby, or any man I chose, because I had no father or brother or uncle to do it, and because it was the custom, and because he did not wish me, on that day, to feel the absence of any man whom I might have wished to walk beside me. I had thanked him, and I had said no, I should walk myself, because I had spent 7 years walking nowhere by myself, And I should like, on this day, to walk the length of a chapel under my own power with my own feet, to the man of my own choosing, and no other arm under mine. He had bowed his head, and he had said, "Madam, it is as it should be." Hetty and Huldah stood at the front, in the first pew on the right, Hetty in blue and Huldah in her best gray with a new lace cap, and they both wept quietly through the whole of the service, and I could not look at them, because if I had looked at them I should have wept also. Captain Blackwell stood at the Duke's shoulder as his groomsman, in his dress uniform, and Dr. Mallaby sat behind Hetty in the second pew with his old wife, and the chaplain was a soft-voiced gentleman from Alnwick named Mr. Whitfield, who had christened half the villages on the coast. There were no other guests. We had agreed upon it. A wedding which had been 7 years in the unmaking did not, we thought, require a large audience. I walked the length of the aisle. I walked slowly, because I wished to feel every step. My slippers made almost no sound on the old stone floor. I looked ahead at Cassian, who stood at the altar in his black coat, and whose gray eyes had never been softer, and whose hand, when I reached the altar and he put out his hand to take mine, was steady, though I felt, in the pulse of his wrist against mine, that his heart was not. We said the words. We said them plainly, the old words, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. And I heard my own voice say them, and I heard his, and I felt a ring go upon my finger, gold and very plain, and I placed a ring upon his, and we turned, and we walked down the aisle together, and as we passed the first pew, Huldah reached out and touched the hem of my veil with the tips of her fingers, as one might touch a holy thing, and I bent and kissed her cheek, and Hetty caught my hand and pressed it. And then we were at the door of the chapel, and the door was open, and the June light was coming in, and we stepped out together into it, and I thought, again, of Miranda. We sat that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, the two of us, by the fire in the small blue parlor that had been my mother-in-law's favorite room, and he had his coat off and his cravat loosened, and I had my veil folded neatly on the table, and my hair only loosely pinned, and we had a pot of tea between us, and a plate of Huldah's shortbread, which she had baked that morning at the crack of dawn in her own kitchen and brought up to the castle in a basket. Because, she said, a wedding is not a wedding without a shortbread of one's own making. I thought, as I sat there, about doors. I thought about the door of the cellar at Ravenmere, oak and iron, which had kept me in for 7 years and 112 days, and which had been opened in the end not by a key, but by a shoulder, and not by a magistrate, but by a man, and how that man had stood in the frame of it with snow on his cloak and had said, "Miss Valgard, would you like to come out?" And how those 9 words were the words that had begun my second life. I thought about the doors I had opened for myself since, the library door, the garden door, the stable door, the door of the carriage that had taken me to Alnwick for the trial, the door of the chapel that morning, the door, in some older and stranger sense, that I had opened in my own heart to allow another person in, after 7 years of having learned that letting another person in was a kind of death. I thought about Celestria, who is on the far side of the world now, in a colony of penal exile, and I thought about her with neither love nor hatred, but with a quiet hope that she had indeed been given a lamp, because I remembered, more clearly than I liked to, how dark the cellar had been before Huldah had brought me my first candle stub, and I would not have wished that darkness upon anyone, not even upon her. I thought about silence. I thought about the silence of a locked cellar, and the silence of a loveless dining room, and the difference between them and the similarity between them, and how Cassian had ridden 3 days through the frost because he had known, in the bones of his own house, what a silence could do, and how he had refused, in the end, to let one more silence stand when a shoulder would open it. I thought, last, about the quiet arithmetic of dignity. I thought about how a person, when she is reduced to nothing, may keep a thing called dignity, which is perhaps only the small stubborn habit of washing one's face, and of combing one's hair, and of reading a book one has read 100 times, and of speaking the word boatswain aloud in an empty room in order to keep one's voice in tune. I thought about how the sum of such small habits, kept up over 7 years, had been the exact shape of the person the Duke of Stormcairn had found when he had opened the door, and how, if I had not kept them, he should have opened the door upon someone else, someone less whole, and he had been spared that sorrow by the very patience he had not been there to see. I thought about how a door breaks open, in the end, not with noise, but with a hand. A hand that decides, in some cold barn of a hall 3 days' ride away, to saddle a horse. A hand that does not turn back at the snow. A hand that presents a parish register to a white-faced woman in a front hall and says, "Madam, I have not come through the frost to be told she does not exist." A hand that puts a shoulder to an oak door, and then, before it has stepped in, takes off its own cloak and lays it over another. I thought, and my husband watched me think, without interrupting, in the way he had always watched me, near but not crowding, and at last he said, softly, "What are you thinking, my dear?" And I said, "I am thinking about doors." And he said, as he set down his cup, "A good thing to think about." And I took his hand. The fire burned low. The candles guttered in their sconces. Somewhere, deep in the castle, a clock struck 12, and midsummer gave way to the ordinary days that would follow it, the days of being a wife, of being a duchess, of being, at last and most importantly, a person among persons and not a person alone. I rose. He rose. We put out the candles, one by one, and we went up the winding stone stairs to our own rooms, and the castle settled around us as castles do, and the sea, beyond the window, kept up its long, soft argument with the cliff. And I thought, as I lay down at last beside my husband in the great oak bed with its canopy of pale yellow silk, that I had been, for 7 years, a girl in a cellar with a book and a candle stub and a basket of rye bread, and that I was now, at 23, a woman in a castle with a husband and a friend and a garden and a horse and a library and a sea, and that the distance between those two places was the exact measure, I believed, of the kindness of one man who had come for me, and of the patience of 2 women who had waited with me and for me, and of the private stubbornness of a girl who had decided, in the dark, not to be less than herself. I closed my eyes. I slept. And in my sleep, I did not dream of the cellar. I dreamt instead of daffodils, and of a red stone set in a south wall, and of a voice saying, "Ma'am, would you like to come out?" And I dreamt my own voice answering, "Yes, I would, I would, I would."